Yeah, my name is Michael Lauer. I teach 7th grade life science at Heritage Middle School in Meridian, Idaho. Yeah, it's a lot of things. When I first thought about this question, I thought about kind of the continuum that goes on is you go through teaching and that, early on that high expectations can look procedural. It's like, kids have a journal, you have your homework done on time, you keep track of your notes, things like that. But then as you develop your craft in teaching, there's a whole lot of other things that comes along with high expectations that are really important to me now, that when I think back at my beginning of my career, what I meant is a high expectation. That's a good place to start, and that's kind of the superficial level, but where I'm at now with it is definitely much different. And it's more into this higher level, kind of both cultural and pedagogical. So what's going on in the classroom among the students, and then what am I doing specifically as a teacher? And so there's a couple things, but I think ultimately, if I were to distill that down to one thing, it's taking ownership in your learning. So the high expectations are that I'm not necessarily setting every expectation for you as a 7th grader, but you're setting expectations for yourself. You're taking ownership, you're making those decisions. So a couple specific examples, I have kids develop rubric criteria. So in the first semester, I spend more time giving them the individual checkpoints and criteria for building models or constructing explanations or whatever that they're doing. And then as the year goes on, I then start giving them the topics, but leaving the specifics blank and asking them, like, what do you think it means to demonstrate mitosis or whatever it is that we're working on? So I think part of those expectations are that they're in charge. And so then it's less about me and it's more about, like, what are you capable of and how are you going to demonstrate that? And so what's interesting about that is that most times the kid doesn't take the easy road out. It's interesting, and that's an interesting place to be as a 7th grader, to say, whoa, what does that really mean? And more often than not, they're trying to figure out, how do I go above and beyond, and how do I really meet this, versus like, what's the bare minimum when you put that ownership on them. So it's kind of interesting. So another thing with expectations is asking them to make decisions like in the assessment format. So if we're building models, if we're constructing explanations, if a student's responsible for collecting and working with data, I give them a lot of decision making in that. And so again, by it not being, I have expectations in terms of quality and things like that, but then they're doing a lot in terms of building the expectation. Again, so it's not about me, it's about what are you capable of and what do you want to do, improve and accomplish. Another thing that's been a lot of fun to play with is giving them opportunities to create work for real audiences. That really raises expectations. So if the purpose of a task is to go into the basket so that the teacher can check it off or do whatever with it, that's not a super big motivator for kids or adults or anyone. But anytime there's a real purpose behind that, like there's going to be an audience reading your work, or you're going to be presenting these ideas to peers, or I've had instances where I've brought in community members and faculty and other adults in the library and had students present ideas. That real audience, one, kids want it, and two, that raises the bar because there's a reason to produce that work. It's because they're being honored. They're giving the opportunity to share their experiences, their knowledge, whatever it is that they figured out with other people. Another thing that I think is important with setting high expectations is just the context that kids are working in. That every time I can find an opportunity to connect what we're learning back to the real world, that raises expectations just naturally, in that kids are invested in it because it's a real thing. It's not some arbitrary thing that we're doing in 4th period in 7th grade in life science, but it's like, whoa, this science really matters in the world. People are using this to figure out stuff. So then kids are engaged in this wider conversation and discussion, and then they're part of figuring out solutions or working with real problems. And so it's a natural way of just raising the expectations that we're not just doing this to like jump through a hoop because it's, again, 4th period life science and we need to learn about ecology. It's because, hey, we're a part of a real ecosystem and there's real threats to that, and we could be part of the solution to that. So that's really important. And another example this year was we did some work with climate change, and specifically we were looking at the oxygen carbon dioxide cycle. And so I said, so what's up with this whole CO2 molecule? Why are people talking about it a whole bunch? And we got into climate change and asked kids to think about solutions. We said, okay, you know, countries can do big expensive things, and cities and states and, you know, other entities can do big expensive things that take time, but what can you do as a seventh grader? What could your family do? And it was amazing. Like, we have this whole wall in our classroom of solutions they came up with based on real evidence of the problem and real evidence of how their solution would actually help the problem. And so again, that motivation is like a huge part of expectations. If they're doing something for a real purpose, they're going to be doing it at a much different level than if they're just kind of going through rote completion sort of stuff. Another thing, I've been involved with the committee that wrote the new science standards for Idaho. And I think new standards are really going to help us raise expectations for kids, because those standards are performance-based. So science is not about a collection of facts that you're going to memorize based on a study guide to do a unit test, but you are doing science and then proving that you have abilities as a scientist by creating models, creating explanations, solving problems. And so I think there's, you know, a huge shift there that's going to happen in a lot of classrooms that is, you know, going to cause teachers to think about the fact that these standards are embedded with higher expectations. Like, our kids are operating as scientists. And so that again changes the way we teach, and it's changed the way I've taught. Those standards combined with just really an emphasis on inquiry-based learning has really, really helped me raise the standards. Because again, we're not just doing something to learn some facts, we're doing something to figure out how the world works, and then what can we do with that knowledge to make the world a better place. Engaging kids in collaborative problem solving and learning where they're working together as a team raises expectations, because then again, you're responsible now to more than just yourself. You're responsible to the community, and it might be a group of 3 or 4 kids, or it might be that your group then is responsible back to the whole class, because you're going to be sharing what you figured out. So I really try to use those opportunities to set expectations that, hey, this is bigger than just you, this is bigger than just completing a task, this is about a community of learning, and we need you to be a part of that community of learning, and we need you to share what you've learned. And again, when there's a real purpose to what they're doing, it just naturally raises the expectations, and kids will respond to that. A couple things related to prior knowledge. Like, first, you have to know the prior knowledge of content, and you know, I find that challenging sometimes when it comes to differentiation, because we have so many students at the school I teach in that were not in this school last year, or were not necessarily in the state of Idaho before. So it used to be more so that I'd say, how many of you learned blank last year? And I would know the answer to that because they were all in 6th grade downstairs, and that's not the case. So something really important is just establishing, like, what experiences have you had with content? Have you learned about DNA, or have you learned about ecology before? But another thing that's really important is understanding their prior knowledge of skills and strategies. So not just content, but if we're writing arguments, like, what's your experience with argument writing? Because that's going to help me set some expectations for you. And that's going to also help me tap into cross-curricular opportunities, and to find out by talking to my ELA counterparts across the hall, for example, like, where are the students at when it comes to developing a claim and, you know, using evidence to back that up. Another thing that I think is important is, like, their interest, gauging their interest. So, you know, in terms of ensuring that I'm able to set those high expectations, is like, where do you guys experience this stuff in the real world, or what connections do you see to the stuff we're learning in the world around you? And so that requires, as a teacher, kind of figuring out themes, or you know, and like the new generation of science standards, it's looking at cross-cutting concepts and saying, hey, we're talking about patterns. Like, where do you see patterns in the world? What are your experiences with patterns? Or working with cells as a system, like, what's a system in your life and how does that system work? And kids are able to, you know, talk about their experiences with different systems, from their family to a soccer team to whatever. And then, you know, so taking this knowledge of content, this knowledge of skills and strategies, this interest in the real world, those things combined together can help me decide how to set expectations and what these kids are capable of. Another thing that's interesting is having students generate questions. And that really puts them in the game and they have ownership of the learning. So, I avoid as much as possible telling them things and as much as possible asking my own questions, but then presenting kids with phenomena and asking them to generate questions. Like, what are you curious about? What are you interested in? What do we need to figure out? And so, again, I think a lot of the things you do in your teaching strategies are connected to the expectations you can then set for kids. And a lot of this goes back to just ownership and decision making. So instead of me listing every criteria for success for them, I'm asking them to do that. And so they need coached through that. And they need help figuring out how to set their own expectations and their own goals. But I find that there's a big payoff in that if they are involved in making these decisions and they're pursuing answers to their questions. Again, the more I can say, hey guys, I'm not telling you to do this. I didn't decide what you're going after. You guys are deciding this. So this is your thing. And again, they have that pride and ownership, and then they have that investment, and I think that raises the bar for everyone. So yeah, first off, the follow through. When there's high expectations and kids have created those expectations, there's much better follow through in what they do and what they turn in, and then the performance that they do, and how their abilities show through. And I think something that's also important is that I see them dig in more, so I see more grit and more perseverance. If they're doing a rote task, which I try to avoid, and they know the purpose of the task is just, it's some sort of rote thing, there's no investment, or the expectation is you're just doing this to fill time. And I never do that. It doesn't matter. If I'm gone, I don't just give them something because there's going to be a sub there. It's, hey, I'm gone, but you guys are trying to figure this thing out, and you're going to continue to figure this thing out, and then I'll be back the next day and I'll check in with you and see what you figured out. So there's a black and white difference when a teacher gives a kid a Xeroxed worksheet from a book and says, do this, or says, read section blank and answer the vocab and the questions at the end, versus a teacher posing a big question or having kids come up with their questions and saying, go chase the answers, let's figure it out. So it's huge, just the way they're engaged and the way they're invested and the way they come to class. And you can really, it's working when kids come into class and you don't have to say anything and they just start digging in. So when we're working on some sort of sustained process, whether it's an investigation or an inquiry, or they're at the point where they're doing an assessment piece, so they're building models, when you don't have to say anything, maybe you have directions or reminders projected when you walk in the room, but those days are really fun when kids just come in and they grab materials. And I can think of an example. Recently we were making stop motion animations of mitosis. And so it was not memorize the 4 phases of mitosis, it was I presented them with the phenomena up front. So an animated, unlabeled model of a cell going through mitosis. And I said, what is this, guys? And so most of them could say, oh, it's a cell. And I'm like, well, what's it doing? Well, it looks like it's splitting. And I said, but what else is going on in there? What don't we know? And they listed a million different things. And I said, cool, we're going to figure it out. And then you're going to make your own version of this, except for your version's going to be explanatory. You're going to be able to say what's going on and what are those little blue parts and what are those little thread-like things. And so, again, kids were making a lot of decisions. They were working at their interest level. They were working with technology that they were really into. And during that project, I didn't have to say anything. Once they had made the decisions about what they were going to do and who they were going to work with and how they were going to do that, they came in and they grabbed stuff, and it didn't matter that I was in the room or not in the room. They were totally engaged in doing that. So I think, and that's another important point, is that anytime learning is generative, you are creating stuff, you are making meaning, and then making physical products that represent your meaning and understanding. That raises expectations for kids, and there's huge payoffs in their engagement and their interest and their motivation to learn. One of the biggest things is it's how the real world works. It's how we accomplish things in the real world, is that we have to dig in, we have to try hard, we have to work towards solutions that are not obvious, and that's how anyone's going to be successful in anything that you're doing, whether it's work related or whether it's school related or whether it's learning a new hobby or something that you're interested in, a new sport. It doesn't matter. So I really feel that kids need to have some competitive drive, and they need to know how to perform, and they need to know what it means to excel. And it's the only way we're going to solve problems that are facing this world, is that we have kids that can set some high expectations and then can meet those high expectations. So it's really important to me because school, as much as anything, we certainly like to throw around college and career preparedness and things like that, but it's preparing kids for citizenry. It's preparing them to be productive parts of communities and people who are going to figure out things that need figured out, whether it's related to health and medicine, whether it's related to how ecosystems function, whether it's related to new technologies that can do things for us as people. Those high expectations that I set for kids, in that I help kids set for themselves, are then going to help them operate in the world that way, where they can go out and they can find things that are worth doing, and they can figure out, how am I going to do that and be successful at it.